Let's begin discussing another selection of vocabulary terms, this time covering the topic of genre. Now, remember, for these vocabulary terms, we're just going to be going over the essentials, the absolute basics. We're looking at the pronunciation of different terms, and we're looking at a really quick definition of each. Let's go ahead and begin, take a few notes, and get started. First topic is going to be nonfiction. Nonfiction literature is a genre of writing that is based on facts and real-life events. It can be used to inform, educate, and entertain readers. The key word here is real. If you want to help remember it, nonfiction equals not fake. It's real content that you're going to be getting when you're reading nonfiction. Next term, fiction. Fiction is a genre of literature that is based on imaginary events and characters. It can be used to explore themes, ideas, and emotions in a creative way. To help you remember that fiction is the one that is made up stuff, think of fiction as fake or made up, and it's going to help you remember that term. Now, each of the rest of the genres and subgenres that we'll be discussing can usually fit within one of those two, of fiction or nonfiction. I'm going to start with two that are going to appear in nonfiction: biographies and autobiographies. Biographies are written accounts of a person's life written by another person. So if I write a book about the life of Abraham Lincoln, that's a biography because I wrote the book. It's going to be an autobiography if it's written by the person that the book is about. So if Abraham Lincoln wrote a book about his own life, that would be an autobiography because he wrote it. The next two terms are going to be memoirs and historical fiction. Memoirs are personal accounts of a person's life experiences, so think nonfiction. An example would be I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai. She's an education activist that wrote a book about her life story, so she wrote a memoir about her life. It's a little bit different from an autobiography because it's more of a narrative form. It's more of a story form. Historical fiction is, of course, going to be fiction, and this would be fictional stories set in a historical context. So if you read a book that's set during World War II, and it's got a lot of true facts about World War II, but it's a character that's made up, and that's going to be historical fiction. The next one, which is typically going to be fiction, is drama. Drama is a form of literature that tells a story through dialogue and action. It is often performed on stage or screen, but can also be read aloud or experienced through audio recordings. If you're involved in the theater or drama department in the school, then you're probably very familiar with this. You're telling a story, and it's sort of its own little genre that fits and often displays other genres that we're going to talk about. The next term is going to be poetry. Poetry is a form of literature that uses rhythm and imagery to express emotions and ideas. There are many different types, like free verse poetry, haiku, limericks, acrostic poems, etc. But again, we're just introducing the term, so just know that poetry can express kind of like stories, themes, or ideas in a different way than a lot of the other types of writing and genres we're looking at. The next few genres we're going to be looking at would be folklore, myths, and fantasy. Folklore are stories passed down through generations, often with a moral or lesson to help guide them. Typically, these are going to be kind of close to fables, which we'll look at later. Think of folklore as more like stories that a culture, a civilization, or a country or a group kind of passes down and uses to tell stories important to them. Myths are stories that explain the origins of natural phenomena or cultural traditions. So if you're familiar with mythology, stories like Greek and Roman myths, this is probably what you're going to be looking at here. Typically, we're explaining things like the weather or natural disasters or just various different other things that impacted people's lives when they didn't have the science to understand what was happening, so they came up with these myths to explain them. Finally, one that's a little bit different than these others is fantasy. Fantasy involves imaginary worlds and creatures, often with magical elements. That's a really small definition for something that can be very, very big, but just think as fantasy is typically a type of fiction. It's going to have something magical, imagined. It can take place on Earth, but if it does, it's going to have very made-up things happening, things outside of the bounds of typical explanation. The next two genres we want to take a peek at real quick are science fiction and horror. Science fiction explores the genre of literature that often involves futuristic settings and technology. Think if it involves space travel, things that we can't currently do as humankind, then that's probably going to have to do with science fiction. Of course, we can do space travel, but think like deep space or things that we can't do with the technology we currently have. Maybe it has to do with robots or artificial intelligence or things like that. You often have a lot of dystopian fiction, which is something that you'll talk about a little bit later on when you get a little bit deeper into these different types, occurring within science fiction stories. Next up, we have horror, which explores the genre of literature that involves suspense, fear, and the supernatural. Think spooky. If you've seen a very scary movie before, then that falls within the horror genre of movies, and the similar stories in books would be in the horror genre of books. Next up, we have legends and fables. You've probably heard a lot of fables in elementary school or from a very young age. Fables are stories with a moral lesson, often featuring animals as characters. There's a picture of a tortoise here because you might recall the story of the tortoise and the hare. Slow and steady wins the race, that type of thing. Typically, you have animals that do something that ends up teaching a lesson at the end. The next topic, the next genre, would be legends, and these are stories passed down through generations, often featuring heroic characters. For the legend of King Arthur and stuff like that, then it's going to fall within this little genre of legends. Next up, comedies and thrillers. Comedies are funny stories that make us laugh and enjoy life. Thrillers are exciting stories that keep us on the edge of our seats. Westerns are a genre of literature that typically takes place in the American West and features cowboys, outlaws, and other characters that you typically think of when you think of the Old West. There are a lot of stories set as Westerns and have been for a long time, and a lot of them can be pretty interesting. Looking at a couple more, tall tales and fairy tales. Tall tales are stories that exaggerate the truth, often featuring larger-than-life characters. Things like stories about Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill and the very ridiculous feats that those guys supposedly did would fall under tall tales. Fairy tales are traditional stories featuring magical elements such as talking animals and enchanted objects. So, as far as fairy tales go, these are a little different from some of the others because of just the type of stories that they are. You've been hearing fairy tales since you were very little. We'll look at some examples too. Diary and encyclopedia entries. Diary entries are personal records of events, thoughts, feelings written by an individual. So, of course, that's going to be nonfiction. It's not fake, it's something that somebody's writing down. Although, to make it a little bit more complicated, you could read a fictionalized diary. Sometimes authors will set their books and like they're a diary. If you've read Diary of a Wimpy Kid stories or seen those, that would be sort of an example. It's a character's play-by-play thoughts set up in a diary or a journal format. Moving on, encyclopedia entries, of course, would be nonfiction. An encyclopedia entry is a factual article about a particular subject. You may use that for research because it's nonfiction, it's going to have good information, it's going to have sources and research to back it up. And that comes to our very brief discussion of some genres that we'll be looking at over the course of the next little bit. Thank you for viewing, and have a good day.